Well, good morning. My name's Mary Ellen Dombrowski. I'm president of the Connecticut River Valley Chamber of Commerce, and I'm also the administrator of ERCCA, East of the River Chambers of Commerce. And that is an organization comprised of the South Windsor Chamber, Greater Manchester Chamber, Tolland County, and the Connecticut River Valley. So today we have our legislative update presented by our Andy Markowski. But I want to first thank our sponsor, AT&T, for supporting ERCCA for so many years. And I'd like to introduce Abby Jewett, who's the Regional Vice President of External and Legislative Affairs for AT&T. Good morning, Abby.
Good morning, Mary Ellen. Thank you, and welcome, everyone. I just wanted to say that 2020 obviously is an unprecedented year, and hopefully one that won't repeat itself for a long time to come. And I think one of the biggest obstacles that we're finding is the ability to get information. And normal means have kind of gone by the wayside, and just human interaction has gone by the wayside. And so I very much appreciate ERCCA and Mary Ellen with the Connecticut River Valley of continuing to find new and innovative ways to bring people together. And nothing more important than our political process and lots of big things to come. So I appreciate Andy coming and giving us his expertise, and I look forward to hearing what he says. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. I guess I'll kick it off then. Thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you, Abby. So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, Andy Markowski with Statehouse Associates. I'm a lobbyist up at the Capitol, and I've had the pleasure of working with Mary Ellen and the Chamber, as well as all of ERCCA for the last several years. My role with ERCCA at the state capitol is really to be their eyes and ears. As business owners, as chamber members, all of you, of course, are busy trying to run the operations of your business day to day. Certainly, you don't have time to keep track of everything that's going on at the state capitol under normal circumstances, let alone this unprecedented year that we've had. And I think Abby just said it really well in terms of the need for information this year and over the last several months, and the need to share information. And, there's obviously lots of inaccurate information that floats around out on social media and, the rumor mill. So it's important not just to have timely information, but accurate information and information that's valuable to business owners and members of the business community. And that's certainly why being a member of the chamber is so important. There is not only strength in numbers, but the chamber in and of itself is a clearinghouse of all sorts of information for your business. And particularly from my perspective, government relations perspective, the type of information that's coming out of the state capitol, public policy that impacts business owners and the chamber. So being a part of the chamber is a tremendous benefit. The government relations benefit that you receive as being a chamber member is tremendous. Most businesses don't have the ability to go out and hire their own lobbyists to monitor legislation or work on their own individual issues. So that's why, again, it's so important that the business community and the chamber members and the ERCCA region come together collectively. And it's a tremendous member benefit. Again, there's strength in numbers. So I would, encourage you to tap into the resources that you have at your disposal. Reach out to Mary Ellen, reach out to the chamber staff, and, ask questions, offer suggestions, and just have an opportunity to get involved. And we will certainly do what we can to assist, as I know Abby and her team will as well. And again, to reiterate what Mary Ellen said, I just want to thank Abby and AT&T for sponsoring this, and also just, a shout out to Abby Jewett and also John Emra and the entire team at AT&T. They are great partners at the state capitol in terms of working on legislation together and really just looking out for the interests of business owners and members of the business community and members of the chamber. So glad you can be here today, Abby. You know, we've got I think what I want to do over the next few minutes is give kind of an overview of where we've been, what's happening now, and what may be on the horizon coming up later this year and looking ahead to 2021. And I think many of us are anxiously looking ahead to 2021. I think there's many people who just want this year to be over with and, you know, kind of have a clean slate and move on to next year. And hopefully there are better things around the corner. I think we will leave time, Mary Ellen, at the end for plenty of questions and Q&A. And, you know, I know we're using this virtual format, so I know there's a chat board and a Q&A function. So if people want to, you know, write something into the chat or the Q&A, that's fine as well. And then hopefully we can just open it up and have a free-flowing interactive discussion amongst the participants and those who are interested. So to get things started, you know, we came into 2020 and no one really could have predicted where we are today, certainly. You know, the 2020 legislative session in Hartford was scheduled to be the quote-unquote short legislative session, scheduled to run from February through early May. But I think when the session started back around February 6th, no one could have anticipated it would be this short, or as short as it was. Essentially, by the middle of March, legislative operations shut down and have really yet to resume in full. Upon the declaration of public health emergency at the state capitol, things really changed. And when I say things changed, not just from an operational standpoint, meaning the capitol was closed, but things changed in terms of how our state government functions. The state has been operating since then effectively under the executive authority of the governor and the governor's office. And that is a process that was spelled out in state statute and that was afforded to the governor by legislative leadership and a special emergency public health committee that was convened. And what you've seen is legislators, and you know, perhaps later on, Representative Berry, great to see you here. Would love to hear your perspective on legislating during this crisis. From my viewpoint as a lobbyist, what I've seen is that legislators have had to shift their roles as well, going from lawmakers to information brokers and information gatherers as well, serving the constituents and getting the information out there. And I certainly don't envy the role of a legislator right now. You know, as a representative of the business community, I receive those tough phone calls from business owners who are worried about laying people off or worried about how they're going to keep their own business functioning. And I know legislators receive those types of calls as well. What I would like to point out is that since the middle of March, right on or about March 15th, approximately, we have seen the governor's office issue, I believe by last count, 67 executive orders. And that's pretty unprecedented in such a short time period. But the reason why that had to happen is there were so many different changes that need to be made to our state laws, and many of those changes needed to be made on a nearly real-time basis. That it was important that the governor's office was empowered and given the flexibility to make those changes. And that those were done via executive order to respond to the public health emergency that we've seen. You know, in some ways, those executive orders, I feel, have impacted the business community more than traditional legislation even would. And I'm not even necessarily speaking to the substance of what was contained in those executive orders, but just the timing. Under normal circumstances, when a law is changed or a law is repealed, for example, it's an act of the legislature. The legislature does it during their normal course of a legislative session in the first half of the year. Very often, the effective date of that legislation is sometime in the future, maybe 3 months after passage, 6 months after passage, sometimes a year after passage, giving people time to know what's coming, adjust, and be prepared. What we've seen with the executive orders is quite the opposite. They often come out on a near daily basis. They take effect immediately. And the reason for that is the nature of the emergency that we found ourselves in and the need for state government to take swift action. And in many cases, the substance of the executive orders was not necessarily passing anything new or imposing a new law or a new regulation or a new mandate, but in many ways it was actually providing more flexibility for businesses, reducing regulations, reducing permitting requirements, extending filing deadlines for tax deferrals and permitting fees and a whole host of things. But what I think, good, bad, ugly in terms of substance of the executive orders, there's no doubt they've had a profound impact on the business community, some more than others. I just want to highlight a few off the top of my head that I think nearly every business owner is aware of by now or should be. But if not, certainly something to keep an eye on as these issues develop. Obviously the biggest one right away was the decision to deem some businesses essential and some businesses non-essential, right? And I think we have all been through that early period in the spring where certain segments of the economy were shut down, others were allowed to keep operating with new rules, with new guidance, with a whole new structure in place. So I think that was really the first critical executive order that had a lot of business owners paying attention and understanding that, things are different in Connecticut, and what happens at the state capitol, what happens in the governor's office is very important to not just, the business community's day-to-day operations, but their long-term survival as well. So hopefully everyone is paying attention now. And I think what they've seen, as I already mentioned, is a lot of these, new orders were done, of course, in the name of public health and in public safety. And when people hear that, I think a lot of people do think that it means more restrictions, more requirements. And again, I'll go back to, other than the essential, non-essential designation. And it's important to point out, I think as well, that here in Connecticut, we're very fortunate to some extent. And, if you're one of those businesses that was essentially forced to be shut down by the government, you might not view this the same way, of course. But as compared to other states, the nature of the executive order deeming certain businesses essential and being allowed to stay open was much more broad than elsewhere. We had many types of businesses and sectors of our economy that were allowed to stay open here that were not in just our nearby states of New York and Pennsylvania, for example. And a lot of outdoor businesses, construction, landscaping, those types of things come to mind immediately. So that was, I guess, the one order that a lot of people deemed restrictive. Of course, there's, the other orders that were done in the name of health and safety, how restaurants need to operate. I think everyone has seen the plexiglass shields that are, nearly everywhere right now. Of course, there's the mask mandate. And again, with the mask mandate, as it impacts the business community, the governor's office and the executive branch have been very partnering with business owners who have questions and who point out concerns like, okay, if a customer comes into my business and refuses to wear a mask, is the business liable, for example? How does that get enforced? And a recent executive order actually clarified that businesses can refuse service to a customer or a vendor or someone who does not want to wear a mask. And I think, again, that's also an important distinction that makes Connecticut different from many of the other states in the way they're operating right now. Getting back to the executive orders, a couple others I want to highlight that I think the business community needs to be aware of if they're not already. One, of course, concerns the topic of unemployment insurance. And that's a big one that I think everyone is concerned about right now. And I think what the business community has been wondering is, as certain businesses have had to pare back operations, either because they simply weren't able to stay open or just because of customer demand and more employees were taking applying and receiving the unemployment insurance is that the business costs would not go up in the future, that there would not be any sort of additional surcharge or cost impact on employers for their unemployment insurance premiums, basically because the employer had to lay people off or reduce their workforce through no fault of their own. And one of the very early executive orders by the governor did clarify that there should be no penalty provision on employers who are forced to lay people off through no fault of their own, essentially a hold harmless provision as it relates to the surcharges that are sometimes levied on employers based on their experience rating. Under normal times, if an employer obviously has a high claims rating, a large number of layoffs, their future unemployment insurance costs will go up. We need to make sure that that stays level for employers through this crisis and coming out of this crisis. So that was a positive note that came out pretty early on that employers should be aware of, because I know that's a common question. I've heard people wondering, are their unemployment insurance costs going to go up in the future? There's, the quick answer to that is it depends. There are several components that go into an employer's unemployment costs, but the experience rating is just one of them. And that is supposed to stay stable. Now, of course, the bigger picture is what's happening at the federal level with the additional pandemic unemployment assistance, loans to the state unemployment funds. Will the feds essentially hold the states harmless? Meaning, will the federal government come together between the White House and Congress and work out a deal where they tell the states, okay, we realize you had to borrow money. We realize you had to pay out large number of claims. We realize in many cases, such as in Connecticut, you had to upgrade the IT system to process all of the claims because the volume was so overwhelming. Will the states have to pay back the federal government, or will the federal government provide some grants in the future to help these ongoing costs? Those are some of the questions that remain. And those are the areas I think business owners need to look out for in terms of trying to predict what their unemployment insurance costs will be in the future. Shifting from unemployment to workers' comp, that's another area where there was an executive order issued fairly recently. The whole idea of certain businesses that had to stay open, certain employees that had to go to work. And the question becomes, if an employee contracted COVID in the workplace, who is liable for that and who pays for the costs of that, regardless of whether you have health insurance or not? And does an employee who goes to work and contracts COVID, are they eligible to file a workers' comp claim and receive a workers' comp payout? And, there's a lot of discussion about this between employee advocates and the business community and the administration. The thought by employee advocates being that there needed to be a presumption or some more leniency, basically making it easier for an employee who alleges that they contracted COVID in the workplace to be able to receive those workers' comp benefits and receive them in a timely manner. I think from the business community's perspective, the concern is that kind of a one-size-fits-all approach can often be dangerous and perhaps could lead to more claims and a higher workers' comp experience, which in turn impacts the entire business community, not just those businesses that may have had employees who contracted COVID. And so ultimately what ended up passing or being issued was an executive order that clarified that there will be a workers' comp presumption for certain employees in a time-limited period, essentially from the middle of March through early May. And it was those employees who were at essential businesses or who otherwise had to go to work. If they did actually contract COVID as determined by a medical diagnosis, that there is a presumption that they contracted it in the workplace and that they would be eligible for workers' comp benefits. And of course, an employer can rebut that presumption, but there's a process to go through to do that. So that was sort of the for lack of a better term, compromise order that was put out that clarified for both employers and employees alike how workers' comp benefits would be dealt with during the time of COVID, at least early on. I think there will likely be ongoing discussions around this issue, just like there will be ongoing discussions about the unemployment insurance benefits. So those are two big issues I think the business community needs to pay close attention to, not just this year, but looking ahead to perhaps a potential special session of the legislature sometime this fall, and more likely in a regular legislative session coming up in 2021. With that, let me move beyond the executive orders and say it was nice to see the legislature get back to business somewhat in July in a special session. And notice I didn't say business as usual because it was anything but usual up at the state capitol. The capitol was closed to outside visitors, including lobbyists and members of the public. Legislators were operating under an entire new series of protocols in terms of social distancing, the flow of business, the actual presence in the chamber, an entire new electronic voting system. And, just like all of us have gotten used to this format for communication, lawmakers have had their first foray into doing that during the summer special session. The special session that happened last month was narrowly tailored. It focused on 4 bills, 4 topics. The big one, of course, that I think really dominated the headlines was the issue of police accountability and reform issues. The other 3 bills that were dealt with included telemedicine, expanding the use of telemedicine, clarifying payment for telemedicine. I think many of us have perhaps taken advantage of a doctor's visit over the phone or over video using telemedicine, as most major insurance providers have been moving in that direction. In Connecticut, many medical practices have been moving in that direction over the last several years. And it was something that was quite ubiquitous during the last several months. And the legislation that passed seeks to continue that and seeks to clarify whose that payment will continue for those telemedicine visits. But that's a topic that will be revisited next year, as will the police issue, I'm sure. The third issue that was discussed during the July special session was also a healthcare related issue, dealing with insulin, essentially looking at the availability of insulin in emergency situations, and also the cost to patients and those who need it, and trying to put a pricing structure or pricing cap on insulin to make it more affordable. And lastly, there is the issue of absentee voting. We have an election coming up this year. I think everyone's aware. And, we again had our first sort of foray into this a couple weeks ago during the August 11th primaries. And, the issue, of course, is during this pandemic, when many of us are staying home and we have to socially distance and have new health protocols in place, are people at risk going to the polls to vote in person? And certainly there's no question that certain segments of the population are. And, we already had a established process on the books in Connecticut for circumstances that a voter could apply for and receive an absentee ballot. That needed to be re-examined. It needed to be looked at. It needed to be expanded to apply to this COVID situation that we now find ourselves in, to make it clear that certain people can use absentee ballots in the not just the August 11th primary. That was taken care of via an executive order, but most importantly for the general elections coming up in November. So that was the absentee voting issue that was dealt with by the legislature, that essentially mimics what happened during the primary, in that those wishing to vote by absentee in the name of COVID will be able to do so. And of course, that will be handled by the Secretary of State's office and the town clerks at the local level in terms of access to those absentee ballots and how folks can go about that process. So those are the 4 issues that were dealt with in the summer by the legislature in a very narrow special session that just lasted a couple of days. Those 4 issues, though, are not done, like many items of legislation. And just like the workers' comp issue from the executive orders and the unemployment comp issue from the executive orders, I think all of these issues will carry over and be discussed next year in the 2021 legislative session. Things will need to be further refined, re-examined. So those topics are not going away either. So what's ahead for the legislature now? You know, they had a special session in July. The August primaries, of course, happened. It's an election year for all 187 state legislators, everyone in the House, everyone in the Senate. So I think many lawmakers are looking forward to the elections. You know, of course, campaign season this year is going to be, again, unlike any other. Again, in a moment, Representative, very curious to hear your perspective on what the campaign season may look like and how you go about connecting with voters and constituents. But I think once, you know, once the dust settles from the November election, you know, the new legislature, whomever that may be, will be looking just around the corner to 2021. And I guess, you know, assuming the health numbers allow for it, the legislature is scheduled to convene in its regular legislative session in early January, just a few short days after the new year, for the long legislative session in 2021. And of course, 2021 is the start of the new budget biennium. So that's another big topic that's on the horizon that the business community needs to be aware of. You know, we recently closed out the fiscal year here in Connecticut, and you know, there are deficits on the horizon for the next 2 fiscal years. And the questions become, what does that mean for the state budget? And of course, what does that mean? How does that trickle down to impact individual business owners, the business community, and citizens and taxpayers alike? And you know, already we saw the governor recently mentioned to state agency heads across state government that they need to start thinking about what cuts might look like in terms of cuts to services and cuts to agency operations, and try to come up with a list of cuts that might equal 10% of agency budgets. That's something that needs to be considered on the horizon. The other issue we need to look at, Mary Ellen, I'm gonna go on mute for a second. I've got a background emergency here with the children. Hold on.
Life happens, doesn't it?
I'm always amazed that people can do this.
I know. Abby or Jill, did you have any thoughts while we're waiting for Andy to return?
I think Andy's doing a great job. You know, like he said, the legislature session just stopped mid-March, and I went from reviewing bills and attending public hearings and committee meetings to 100% constituent services. And I would say the biggest thing was helping small businesses get their financial assistance, unemployment, just public health issues. It was constant. He talked a little bit about essential businesses. Some of the other things that I know I worked on that was crucial to the business industry was working to get like curbside pickup and you know, order online, pick up in a socially distanced way. Many businesses asked me to help them with that. Going forward and looking to the reopening, many businesses had questions about the guidelines and you know, how to safely reopen. Some businesses had more concern than others. Some thought the reopening guidelines were too strict. Others thought they were too lenient. But I think that's all kind of working itself out. Let's see. going into campaign season, it's a little surreal. Normally I would be knocking on thousands of doors, and I haven't knocked on one door. And it's just surreal. But I would say that every day I talk to probably, anywhere from 5 to 50 different constituents on different issues. So it's definitely changed. It's definitely constituent based rather than legislatively based.
What do you think will happen next session if you're not allowed to convene at the Capitol? Do you think they'll be doing more business remotely?
I would imagine that we would have to, having that amount of people in such close quarters. When we went in July, we literally stayed in our offices. So I mean, we stayed in our offices, and I had very little interaction with anybody. And if you wanted to go to the chambers, it was limited to a certain number of people. I have a hard time believing that we can go from basically not seeing anybody to going into the chambers with 200 plus people crammed in. My understanding is that we have to be in the Capitol building to conduct any legislative business. So I think we will physically be in the building, just where we will be will depend. One thing about special session, there is talk about special session. I have been given dates for the next 2 weeks. However, nothing has been scheduled. And I think with the start of school, I know for myself, when I'll have 3 kids that will be distance learning at least part of the time, it's going to be really hard to convene in the next couple weeks. But we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Jill. Andy, is all well?
I'm back. Crisis averted. Yeah, I had an 8-year-old who fell down the stairs and was, fortunately he's okay, but I think he was just startled. But, like many, I think many working parents can, relate to the fact that we're all in this new norm and we're home, and, in another week or two when schools start, I know every school district's in a different situation, as Representative Berry just mentioned. Some will be distance learning, some will be distance learning full-time, some will be distance learning part of the time, differing schedules. So, that's something that I think employers and employees alike have all had to adjust to as well, working, different hours, being more adaptive and flexible in our schedules. And I think that's kind of here to stay for the future. So that will be interesting. So apologize for that interruption, but I know I left everyone in capable hands to sort of fill in. But I was just pretty much getting ready to wrap up in terms of looking at what's on the horizon for next year. I think I left off talking about the budget situation and what that may mean. I think no one really knows, of course. Each month and each quarter, the revenue collections at the state, get updated, and we have a better picture of what things are looking like. But I think, no doubt that this crisis has put a strain on the economy, of course, and state government as well. Fortunately, Connecticut is in a better cash position than many other states. We do have a decent budget reserve fund or rainy day fund. So, the question is how much of that can help mitigate the impact of the budget coming up in the next fiscal year. Where I think the business community needs to really pay attention, though, is on the revenue side in terms of taxes and tax relief. What type of predictability and certainty is there? Are taxes going to go up? Are there going to be new taxes? Or perhaps, more likely, some recent tax relief or some tax relief that has been scheduled may be further delayed or canceled. And what I mean by that, for example, is, in the last budget cycle, the legislature finally passed as part of their budget, the elimination of the $250 business entity tax. It's kind of a nuisance tax that everyone in the business community has talked about for years. Small business owners particularly were hit by that, and that was finally repealed and eliminated. Likewise, in that same budget, there's the phase out or the sunsetting, so to speak, of the 10% corporate tax surcharge. So the question becomes, as the budget numbers shake out over the next year, do those pieces of tax relief have to be rolled back? So does the business entity tax come back onto the books? Does the 10% corporate tax surcharge that was scheduled to be sunset, does that sunset get pushed further off into the future and the surcharge remain on the books? I think those are the types of things that the business community is going to need to be aware of and keep an eye on in terms of potential tax changes for the future. But I think, you know, the one thing that we do know is that no one can predict the future, and, you know, no one could have predicted what this year would look like. So I'd be loath to sort of speculate on what next year may look like. But, you know, I can tell you, I think, with some degree of confidence that obviously budget's going to be a big issue. Those 4 issues from the special session that I mentioned are going to be items that will be revisited. Workers' comp and unemployment insurance, of course, is something that will be an ongoing discussion and revisited. And, you know, then there's just a whole host of new ideas, new pieces of legislation related to COVID, whether it's, you know, workplace scheduling and flexibility. We've seen bills on that in the past. Those will likely come up again in the future. The healthcare side of things, of course. Education, what does that look like, as we've seen, you know, schools sort of experimenting with different types of learning scenarios. And so bottom line being, you know, a lot has already happened in a very short period of time. I think that's only going to continue to accelerate next year as state government as a whole, whether it's the legislative branch, the executive branch, or both, take a look at these important issues and try to respond accordingly. You know, that's really all I wanted to go into today on a legislative front in terms of, you know, where we've been, what's happening, and what may be happening in the future. But, you know, I thought with the group we have here, maybe we can open it up to discussion. And, you know, I know Representative Berry filled in for me for a little bit, but I don't know if you have any other comments, Jill, that you would like to add, or just offer your perspective on anything I've said or anything that you may see coming up.
I'll just expand a little bit on what I've heard for special session. Again, I heard that it was possible in the next 2 weeks, though nothing has been confirmed. But I've heard that it will be all the uncontested bills that the committees had done up to our departure in March. What I'm understanding, it would be very bipartisan, and bills, you know, just bills that were uncontested. And of course, with the recent Eversource, they had a public hearing yesterday with Pura. I know that the Energy Committee is looking to come out with some legislation. I haven't seen anything. I haven't really heard anything, but I know that that was a push to get something done in special session. But that's all I've heard so far. And like I said, with the kids going back to school and cases spiking in certain areas, I really wonder how it's going to work out.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I neglected to mention the whole Eversource and United Illuminating issue, and, you know, just sort of storm response. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a lot of attention being paid to the utilities right now. You know, in some ways, I haven't seen this level of attention since 2011, 2012, following the October ice storm, and then you know, Hurricanes Sandy and Irene. And, you know, I know Abby you know, lived and worked through all of that at the state capitol too, and I know there's probably ongoing discussion. So that's going to be a big topic for all of the utility providers, all of the public service providers, that the business community is going to need to be aware of and pay close attention to looking ahead to next year.
Andy, one other issue is the family medical leave that's starting in January. And I know we had talked about offering another webinar specific to that, but maybe you can just give a quick overview.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mary Ellen, for bringing that up. So that's another big one. And it's been about a year or so since that issue kind of came to a temporary conclusion, at least after it passed through the legislature. I kind of almost forgot about it, just given everything else that has been going on this year. And part of the reason for that is the nature of when that legislation passed. Like I said before, with legislation, as often is the case, the effective date is pushed out to some point in the future. And even though the Family Medical Leave Act, which essentially creates a new state-run paid family medical leave insurance system for all employees in the state, even though that passed in the 2019 legislative session, the first part of it really impacting employers doesn't happen until 2021. Given everything that's been going on this year, I'm not certain that this will or will not occur as scheduled, but at least as of right now, per the legislation, effective January 2021, payroll withholdings are set to begin from employees, meaning the employee will have 0.5% of their wages deducted from their paycheck to fund this family medical leave insurance benefit. But the actual delivery or administration of those benefits, employees will not be eligible to take this new family medical leave until 2022. So that's the plan as of now, as far as I understand it. Collections and withholding from paychecks begin in January 2021. The program actually goes into effect and is utilized beginning in January 2022. Obviously, between now and both of those dates, there are a ton of unanswered questions. There is a Family Medical Leave Authority, a board of directors, essentially, that is meeting. And I lost video. Can you still hear me on audio?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that Family Medical Leave Board is still meeting, and they are coming up with a set of regulations and trying to get into the nitty-gritty of what this will look like. I have not yet heard any discussions about suspending or putting off that date into the future. As far as I know, the plan is still to have the program launched with collections next year and the program next year, but all of that may very well change. I'd be curious, Representative Berry, if you've heard any discussions on that or any feedback from constituents on it. I know there's a lot of questions. Of course, family medical leave is a hot topic right now under COVID. And, we've had the federal government through the CARES Act come in and sort of say, okay, at least for this year through December 31st, we're going to provide some different emergency leave benefits. And, what does that look like moving forward from the feds? And of course, how does the new state program interact with all of that? So I think those are a lot of the questions that remain.
Right. I haven't heard anything, but I would just say in this environment, anything is possible. I think after the election, there may be talks to suspend it. It's just a huge undertaking at this time when businesses aren't even fully operational. And, employees are just getting back to work, and who knows what's going to happen in the next couple months for these businesses. But I would definitely be supportive of suspending it, at least until we can get through COVID. It's a huge expense for the state. They have to go ahead and do all the infrastructure and all the technology. And, I don't know, but I think just with all the unprecedented expenses that we had to get through COVID. I don't know. I don't know if it's exactly the time. I haven't heard anything, but I know that there are people that would support suspending it, as well as people that would support going ahead with it. So we'll have to see.
Good, thank you. And you know, on a somewhat similar topic, I should also mention the upcoming scheduled minimum wage increase. That's something that the business community, I think, is aware of, and certain employers in particular, particularly those in the service and retail sectors. Again, in 2019, the legislation passed. It provided a schedule of phased-in increases in the minimum wage, ultimately bringing Connecticut to $15 an hour. The next increment of those wage increases is scheduled for this September, where the minimum wage is set to go from, I believe, $11 an hour to $12 an hour. So another dollar increment coming up in September. That's a question for many employers, you know, particularly, again, service, retail sector that have been hit particularly hard by COVID. Can they afford those additional labor costs in this time period? And I do know there are some advocates out there calling for a delay or suspension of that next level increase in the minimum wage.
Yeah, in that legislation, there was a provision that if the GDP was negative for 2 consecutive quarters, that the governor could suspend the scheduled increase. So many legislators have written to the governor asking him to suspend the increase that is scheduled for September. I haven't heard anything yet, but there is a push to suspend that.
Great, thank you.
Ask you a question?
Yeah, please. Yeah, let's
Sure.
certainly open it up. Hi,
In
George.
the state short-term disability program to take effect in 2022, what are the mechanics of that? Is it a percentage of pay? Is it full pay? Is it a cap, you know, as of a certain amount of income? How does that work? I've heard different things, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, great question, George. Thanks. So the broad structure of the mechanics and the benefits were laid out in the legislation. It's been a little while since I've taken a look at it, but off the top of my head, from what I recall, it's up to a 12-week benefit period every year for the eligible conditions, eligible circumstances. It would be up to 100% of pay up to a certain income level. So there are thresholds in there. And that's the basic elements of it from what I can recall. I don't know, Mary Ellen, I know we've had a lot of questions on this topic, and I know that's why you mentioned, you know, it's certainly something that the chamber's looking at doing kind of a more in-depth webinar on in the future. But I don't know if you or Abby can recall anything else about the specifics of that. But George, that's sort of the general structure of it. 12 weeks, up to 12 weeks for the eligible conditions, up to, you know, 100% of pay, up to a certain income level cap.
Yeah.
And you know, those 12 weeks, I should mention too, don't have to be consecutive. That leave can be taken intermittently throughout the year, depending on conditions and so forth.
Now, that's highly unusual. My understanding is as compared with other states. So for example, Rhode Island has a program now, but this is much, much more generous than what they have.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's fair, and I know that was certainly one of the critiques that many in the business community had when this program was going through the legislature, because Rhode Island, California, New Jersey, you know, there's a handful of states that have some type of program in place, but the programs that they had in place were, again, more akin to a short-term type of disability program.
Right.
Connecticut's program was looking to be much more expansive, and kind of layer on a new program to the existing family medical leave laws we had in place. So I think that's where our program differs from other states, will likely be more generous. And I think that's where a lot of those details are still being worked out by this new board, the Family Medical Leave Authority, which is operating through the Department of Labor. It's a public body, a public board. They do have public meetings. I believe they're meeting on a monthly basis. And more information on that can be found through the State Department of Labor on their website.
I guess the question is in regards to the contribution of 0.5% of income. Is that how it's calculated? Is that going to be sufficient to be able to provide that sort of plan? As generous as it is, I think they're going to find out very quickly, because I'm involved with short-term disability, and 0.5% is just like, probably is not going to fly very well. They'll find out very quickly if they move forward with it, to be honest.
Yeah, what's the viability? What's the solvency of a new, it's essentially a public benefits system that's being set up here. And, if we look at any of the other, public benefits systems that are out there, not to pick on any one in particular, but you look at the concerns around the solvency of Social Security, you look at concerns around the solvency of state pension and retirement funds, and you can go down the list. The question becomes, what type of actuarial assumptions is the program based off of, and what type of benefits, utilizations, and payouts are there? And that's been the concern of the business community all along, is that this would be a system that would be overutilized and undercapitalized. And what does that mean for employers? Does that mean that there will eventually be an employer mandated tax or contribution that will have to be put forth to fund this? Or what does it mean for your employees if 0.5% is not enough? Is it mandated that they have to contribute a higher percentage? And now you're, taking out of everyone's income for a benefit that everybody may not utilize. And so that's a concern. I believe in the legislation, there is a provision that would allow, in a circumstance where they're not collecting enough to pay out the benefits, the ability to reduce the benefits. But I think all those specifics still need to be worked out. But then, of course, that begs the question: if you have a system that is not able to provide the benefits that were contemplated, and you're reducing the benefits, how effective is it really? And does the whole thing need to be reexamined?
Yeah, because really it's a safety net is what it's supposed to be. And I do have a friend in California that was able to access that. Now, it wasn't 100%, but it was enough to keep his family afloat for a period of time. And that's a good thing. But if it's overused, then it's really going to be a severe problem, from my opinion anyway.
Agreed. This is something we're going to all have to watch very, very closely. And as this Family Medical Leave Authority gets more of the details worked out, there will be opportunities for the public and members of the business community to weigh in through public hearings and through kind of a regulation or rulemaking process that will inevitably have to occur. Let alone, the legislature's future role in working on this issue. Mary Ellen, let me kick it back to you if you want to field any other questions or pose any other questions or wrap things up. I'm happy to stay on as long as people like.
If there are no other questions, Abby, I don't know if you have any thoughts as we conclude?
No, I just want to say thank you, especially to Andy. Really did a fantastic job as usual. No surprises there. And Representative Barry, thank you for taking the time to come here and give us your insight. And it's really invaluable at this point, and much appreciated. Yeah. Thank you, Mary Ellen, as always. Chambers, fantastic.
And thank you. I want to thank Abby with AT&T for sponsoring this ERCCA event. Even though I have Connecticut River Valley, I'm wearing my ERCCA hat too today. So I want to thank you. And Andy, thank you very much for all you do for ERCCA. And we'll conclude this meeting and we'll let you know when the next one's coming on family medical leave. Thank you all.
Thank you.